The morning the bank froze my business account, my partner texted me, "Don't panic, this happens all the time." I was standing in line at a coffee shop, watching the barista wipe down the counter like it was any other Tuesday. My phone said 9:12 a.m. The receipt printed. My name was spelled wrong. By noon, 3 clients had stopped answering my calls. I still believed it was a mistake. I would learn, very soon, how expensive that belief was about to become. The morning my business account was frozen, I was standing in line at a coffee shop on Southeast Division Street, the kind with chipped mugs and a chalkboard menu that never quite changes. It was raining, the light kind of rain Portland does best, the kind that soaks your sleeves without making any noise about it. I remember checking my watch because I was running 5 minutes late for a client call. It was 9:12 a.m. My phone buzzed once in my hand. A notification from my bank. I assumed it was a fraud alert. I get those sometimes when I travel for work. I stepped forward in line, ordered my usual oat milk latte, no sugar, and only then glanced down. "Your account has been temporarily restricted. Please contact your financial institution." That was it. No explanation, no warning, just a sentence that ended with a period, like the matter was already closed. I didn't panic. Not yet. I paid with my personal card instead, tucked my phone back into my coat pocket, and watched the barista wipe the counter in slow, circular motions. She hummed to herself, off-key, like nothing in the world was wrong. The receipt printed. I picked it up automatically. My name was spelled wrong. 1 extra letter at the end. A small thing. I noticed it, folded the receipt, and slid it into my pocket without thinking much about it. People misspell my name all the time. It didn't feel important. Not then. Outside, I stood under the awning and called the bank. The automated system thanked me for my patience before I had even had a chance to be impatient. I listened to the same loop of piano music 3 times before a human voice came on the line. She sounded young, cheerful, too cheerful. She asked me to confirm my full name, date of birth, and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I did. I've said those numbers so many times over the years that they come out of my mouth without effort, like muscle memory. There was a pause. "I'm seeing a compliance hold on this account," she said finally. "A what?" "A compliance review. It's standard procedure." "What triggered it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I don't have access to that information." I looked out at the street. A delivery truck splashed through a puddle, spraying dirty water onto the curb. A man walked his dog past me, pulling his hood tighter around his face. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes earlier. "How long will it take?" I asked. "I can't give you a timeline." "I have payroll tomorrow," I said. I heard my voice tighten slightly around the edges. "I have vendors. I have client funds moving through that account." "I understand," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't. "You'll be notified when the review is complete. It's Deveris." The call ended with a click. I stood there for another moment, phone still pressed to my ear, before lowering it. The rain had picked up. My latte was cooling in my hand, the cup warm against my palm. I told myself it was a mistake. That was my first instinct. There had to be an error somewhere in the system, a flag tripped by an algorithm, a clerical issue. These things happen. I've built my entire career on fixing problems that look catastrophic from the outside, but turn out to be solvable once you trace them back to their source. I started walking toward my office, a small space above a yoga studio that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. As I walked, my phone buzzed again. A text message. From Daniel. "Don't panic. This happens all the time." I stopped at the corner and read it twice. Daniel was my partner. Officially, my financial operations partner. Unofficially, the person who had been slowly blurring the lines between business and something else for the better part of a year. He had helped me scale faster than I could have alone. He understood the systems, the regulations, the language banks speak when they don't want to say anything real. I typed back. "The account's frozen." 3 dots appeared immediately. "I know. That was strange." I frowned at the screen. "You know," I wrote. "Yeah. I got a notification earlier. It's fine." Just a routine compliance thing. What notification? I asked. This time, the dots took longer to appear. Internal, he wrote. I'll explain later. Later. That word settled uncomfortably in my chest, though I couldn't have told you why. Daniel was calm. He always was. Calm in the way people get when they're used to handling things behind the scenes. I had trusted that calm. Leaned on it. I unlocked the office door and stepped inside. The lights flickered once before coming on. My desk was exactly as I'd left it the night before. Neat stacks of folders. A legal pad with tomorrow's to-do list already written out. At the top, underlined twice, run payroll. I set my coffee down and opened my laptop. 3 new emails had come in while I was walking. The first was from a client I'd worked with for almost 3 years. Hey, it read. Quick question, are we still on for this quarter? I heard something odd this morning. Let me know. The second email was shorter. We're going to pause the contract for now. No hard feelings. Just need to protect ourselves. The third had no greeting at all. Please advise on the status of your firm. We've been instructed to hold off. My stomach dropped, slow and heavy, like an elevator descending too fast. I checked the timestamps. All 3 emails had arrived after 9:30 a.m. I refreshed my inbox. Nothing new. I refreshed again. My phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. It was Maria, one of my longest-standing clients, a woman who had trusted me with her company when it was nothing more than an idea and a spreadsheet. Are you okay? She asked without preamble. I think so, I said. Why? She hesitated. I could hear traffic in the background, a horn honking somewhere behind her. I got a call, she said, from my accountant. He told me there's an inquiry tied to your firm. What kind of inquiry? He didn't say. Just, be careful. It's not ing. After we hung up, I sat very still in my chair. I placed both hands flat on my desk, grounding myself in the familiar texture of the wood. I had been audited before. I had dealt with regulators. None of this was new territory. But this felt different. There was a shape to it. A pattern forming too quickly. I opened our shared drive and checked the folders Daniel managed. Everything looked normal at first glance. Reports filed, documents dated and labeled. I clicked into one file at random. It opened slowly, the loading wheel spinning longer than usual. The author field caught my eye. Not my name. I closed it and opened another. Same thing. I checked the metadata. Creation times. Access logs. My chest tightened. At 8:47 a.m., less than half an hour before my account was frozen, someone had authorized a transaction under my credentials. A large one. Large enough to attract attention. Large enough to trigger a review. I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass of the window beside my desk. Outside, the rain had turned the street into a blur of gray and red taillights. I hadn't made that authorization. I knew that with absolute certainty. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Daniel. Trust me, it read. I've got this. I didn't respond. Instead, I closed my laptop slowly, the way you do when you don't want to make a sound, and looked around the office as if I were seeing it for the first time. The framed certificates on the wall, my name printed in black ink, the life I had built piece by piece, contract by contract, belief by belief. I still thought there was a reasonable explanation. I still believed this could be fixed. I didn't yet understand that the problem wasn't the frozen account. It was that, somewhere between 8:47 and 9:12 that morning, my name had started being used for things I had never agreed to. And everything I trusted to protect me was about to do the opposite. People like to imagine that businesses are born out of big moments. A promotion, a windfall, a dramatic exit from a job that never understood you. The truth is far less cinematic. Mine began in a spare bedroom with a folding desk, a second-hand laptop, and a promise I made to myself not to lie about what I knew and what I did not. I had never planned to run my own firm. I studied organizational management because it felt practical, because I grew up watching my mother juggle 2 jobs and still come up short every month. I learned early that stability was not about ambition. It was about systems, about knowing where the money goes and why it disappears, about reading the fine print before it reads you. After college, I worked for other people, nonprofits, small consultancies, local firms that claimed to value ethics until those ethics became inconvenient. I was good at my job, not flashy, but reliable. The person you called when something did not add up and you needed it to, without shortcuts. When I finally left to work for myself, it was not brave, it was quiet. I gave 2 weeks' notice, returned my badge, and carried a cardboard box down 3 flights of stairs to my car. I did not tell anyone I was starting a business. I did not even know if that was what I was doing yet. The first clients came slowly, mostly referrals. Women running small companies who had outgrown their spreadsheets and did not want to be told they needed a big firm to survive. People who had been burned by advisors who spoke confidently and delivered very little. I listened more than I talked. I charged less than I was worth because I wanted the work. Over time, the work grew. I moved out of the spare bedroom and into the office above the yoga studio. I hired one assistant, then another. I registered the business properly, filed every document on time, paid every fee, followed every rule. I built a reputation not on speed or scale, but on trust. On the fact that when my name was attached to something, it meant the numbers had been checked and rechecked. That reputation mattered to me more than profit. By the time I met Daniel, the firm was stable, not large, but solid. We were never going to make headlines. We were never going to chase venture capital or disrupt anything. We helped businesses stay standing. We kept them out of trouble. We fixed problems before they became stories someone else would tell. Daniel came, recommended by a mutual contact, a former client who said, "He speaks your language, but he thinks bigger." At the time, that sounded like a compliment. He had a background in finance, the kind that looks impressive on paper. Years at regional banks, a stint consulting for larger firms. He knew regulations the way some people know sports statistics, effortlessly, casually, as if they were trivia. Our first meeting was at a neutral place, a cafe downtown where the tables were too small and the music too loud. He arrived early. That made a good impression on me. He had already ordered coffee and asked what I wanted when I walked in. "I've looked over your materials," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "You're doing good work. You're just carrying too much of it yourself." That was true. I had been feeling the strain. Growth brings complexity, and complexity brings risk. I knew that. I had been cautious because I did not want to dilute the culture I had built. Daniel did not push. He did not promise miracles. He talked about structure, about guardrails, about making sure the firm could operate without everything passing through my hands. He said the word compliance the way other people say insurance. Not as a threat, but as a tool. We agreed to a trial period. He would handle certain financial operations, oversight, not control. He would set up systems, not run them alone. Everything would be transparent, documented, reviewed. I insisted on that last part. Transparency was non-negotiable. He smiled and said he would expect nothing less. The personal part happened gradually. Not all at once. Long days turned into late dinners. Conversations about work drifted into stories about family, about mistakes we had both made in our 20s. He knew when to listen. He knew when to let silence sit without trying to fill it. We never labeled it. That was another thing I appreciated. No pressure, no declarations, just a closeness that grew in the spaces between meetings and emails. In hindsight, that should have concerned me. But at the time, it felt mature, adult. Two professionals understanding each other's boundaries. My friends asked questions, light ones at first. "So is he your boyfriend or your business partner?" I laughed them off. I told them it was complicated, that we were being careful. Careful. That word comes back to me now with a bitterness I did not feel then. Because I was careful in the ways that felt obvious. I kept personal and business finances separate. I reviewed reports. I signed off on decisions. I believed that was enough. What I did not account for was how much access I had granted without realizing it. Not because I was careless, but because I believed that shared responsibility meant shared ethics. I had built my life around the idea that if you did things correctly, the system would protect you. That rules existed for a reason. That compliance was a shield, not a weapon. That belief shaped everything. It shaped how I treated clients, how I hired, how I trusted. Looking back, I can see the early signs. Small ones. Things I noticed and dismissed because they did not fit the story I was telling myself. Daniel had opinions about speed, about how slow processes could cost opportunities. He framed them as hypotheticals, as discussions, not directives. He would say things like, "There's the letter of the rule, and then there's how it's enforced." I would push back, gently. We would compromise. I thought that was healthy. I also noticed how easily he navigated conversations with institutions, banks, regulators, vendors. He knew who to call. He knew which words opened doors. I admired that. It felt like an asset, not a risk. By the time the firm reached the point where outside scrutiny was inevitable, I believed we were ready. We had policies, procedures, documentation. I believed that if anyone looked closely, they would see what I saw, a business built on diligence and restraint. That morning in the office, as emails stopped being returned and my name appeared in places I had never put it, I clung to that belief. It was not denial, it was consistency. I had lived my life assuming that correctness accumulated, that doing the right thing created a buffer against harm. I did not yet understand that systems do not care about intention. They care about authorization. They care about what appears in the record. And in the record, my name was everywhere. By the end of that first day, I still had not confronted Daniel. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand the shape of the problem before I gave it a face. I went home, cooked dinner I barely touched, and lay awake listening to the rain hit the window. I replayed every decision that had brought me to this point, every signature, every access permission, every moment I had chosen trust over control because it felt like the right thing to do. I had built my life quietly, carefully, by the rules. And somewhere along the way, the very things I believed in had been turned into leverage. I just did not know yet how much it was going to cost me. The first thing that disappeared was time. Not literally, of course. The clock on my laptop kept moving forward, minute by minute, indifferent to my growing sense that the day had started slipping out of order. What I mean is that time stopped behaving the way it normally did. Calls that should have taken 5 minutes stretched into an hour. Emails I expected replies to before lunch sat unanswered until nightfall. By mid-morning, my calendar was still full, but the conversations had changed. At 10 a.m., I dialed into a standing call with a manufacturing client in Beaverton. We had met every Tuesday for nearly 2 years. The agenda was routine: cash flow projections, staffing, a minor vendor dispute I had already drafted a solution for. The line clicked open. I heard breathing on the other end. "Hey," I said, "you're on mute." A pause. Then, "Yeah, sorry, I'm here." His voice sounded different. Not angry, careful. We exchanged pleasantries that felt stiff, like they had been rehearsed. When I started walking through the numbers, he interrupted me. "Before we get into that," he said, "I just need to ask, is everything okay on your end?" I stopped mid-sentence. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said slowly, "we got a call this morning. From our bank. They said there was some kind of issue connected to your firm." "What kind of issue?" I asked. They didn't specify. Of course they hadn't. I explained what I knew. That my account was under review. That these things happen. That there was no finding, no allegation, no conclusion, just a process. He listened quietly. When I finished, there was another pause. "I understand," he said. "We just need to be cautious." Cautious. Another word that would start to sound different to me that day. We ended the call early. At 10:37, I emailed a vendor we were onboarding for a client in Salem. The subject line was simple: next steps. I attached the same documents we had already discussed. 10 minutes later, the email bounced back. Recipient unavailable. I checked the address. It was correct. I tried calling. Straight to voicemail. At 11:15, I left a message for my assistant, who was working remotely that day. She texted back almost immediately. "Hey, just saw your message. I'm getting weird responses from people too. Should I pause outreach?" Pause. I stared at the word on my screen. "Yes," I typed back. For now. 2 have a 6 in 7 dials. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The office felt too quiet. Normally, I could hear muffled music from the yoga studio downstairs, the rhythmic thump of movement through the ceiling. Today, there was nothing. I opened my email again and started scrolling. A pattern was emerging. It wasn't that everyone was cutting ties. Not yet. It was that communication was slowing down, thickening, like syrup poured too cold. People were buying time, creating distance without saying so. At 11:42, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. Is this? The voice hesitated, then said my full name, carefully pronounced. Yes, this is Thomas Reed from Northwest Credit Services. I knew the firm. Mid-sized. Conservative. They handled compliance reviews for regional institutions. We're conducting a routine inquiry, he said. I just need to verify a few details. About what? Your firm. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of inquiry? He cleared his throat. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics. There it was again. That phrase. Polite. Impenetrable. He asked about my role. My responsibilities. Who else had signing authority? Who handled financial operations? I answered honestly. I had nothing to hide. When he thanked me and hung up, my hands were shaking. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds in sharp, uneven patches, lighting up the wet pavement. People walked by with umbrellas tucked under their arms, the storm already forgotten. I felt like I was watching them from underwater. At noon, I called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I sent a text. We need to talk. Now. No response. I ate lunch at my desk without tasting it. A salad I had brought from home, wilted and soggy by the time I opened the container. I chewed mechanically, eyes on my screen, watching as emails continued to arrive in the same cautious tone. We're going to hold off. Let's reconnect once things are clearer. Please keep us posted. No one accused me of anything. No one defended me either. At 1:30 p.m., I tried calling my lawyer, a woman I'd worked with for years, mostly on contract reviews and corporate housekeeping. She picked up on the second ring. I was just about to call you, she said. My heart sank. What do you know? I asked. There's chatter, she said. Nothing formal yet, but your name is circulating. Circulating how? As attached to a transaction that raised flags. I closed my eyes. I didn't make that transaction, I said. I believe you. She replied immediately. But belief isn't the issue. I knew that, even then. She advised me to document everything, to limit communications, to let her handle any formal inquiries. Do not speculate, she said. Do not explain more than you're asked, and whatever you do, don't try to fix this by yourself. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The idea that I could not fix this felt foreign. Fixing things was what I did. At 2:15, I received a calendar cancellation. Then another. Then a third. No explanations, just the automated notice. This event has been canceled. I watched my afternoon dissolve, block by block. At 3 p.m., my phone buzzed. Daniel, finally. Sorry, he wrote. Back-to-back calls. How are you holding up? I read the message twice. How did you know before I did? I typed. The reply came quickly this time. Know what? That the account would be frozen. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I told you, he wrote. It's routine. That's not an answer, I said. Another pause. We'll talk later, he replied. I'm handling it. Handling it. The phrase landed wrong. It implied a distance that had not existed before, as if the situation belonged to him now, not to me. At 3:47, I opened the shared drive again. I told myself I was just checking, just staying informed. But my eyes went straight to the access logs. More entries had appeared. Actions taken under my credentials. Approvals I had not given. Files I had never opened. Each timestamp was precise, each action clean. I felt a coldness spread through my chest. Not panic, but something sharper. Recognition. This was not chaos. This was controlled. At 4:30, my assistant called me. Her voice was tight. "I just got off the phone with a client," she said. "They asked if we're under investigation." "What did you say?" "That we're cooperating with a review." There was a long silence on the line. "Are we?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said after a moment. "We are." When I left the office that evening, the sky was already darkening. The yoga studio lights were off. The street smelled like wet asphalt and cold air. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a second longer than usual, key still in my hand. I had the distinct feeling that if I walked away, something would close behind me that I would not be able to reopen. That night, at home, I lined up my laptop, my phone, and a legal pad on the kitchen table. I made lists, names, dates, access points. I traced the web of my own business as if I were seeing it from the outside for the first time. The realization came slowly, not as a single thought, but as a series of small, undeniable facts. People weren't avoiding me because they knew I was guilty. They were avoiding me because they didn't know I was innocent. And in that space of uncertainty, my silence was being interpreted for me. By the time I went to bed, one thing was clear. Whatever this was, it was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a story already being told, and I was no longer the one controlling the narrative. The networking event had been on my calendar for weeks. A quarterly gathering hosted by a local business council, held in a converted warehouse near the river, exposed brick. Long wooden tables. Cheap wine poured into glasses that pretended to be elegant. Normally, I liked these things. They were predictable. People showed up to be seen, said the same things, exchanged the same cards, and left feeling productive without having changed anything. I almost didn't go. By late afternoon, my instinct was to disappear, to stay home, answer nothing, and let the day burn itself out. But avoidance had never protected me before, and something in me resisted the idea of hiding when I had done nothing wrong. So I put on a navy blazer, the one I wore to client meetings when I needed to look neutral and competent, and drove downtown. The parking lot was already half full when I arrived. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the ticking sound as it cooled. I checked my phone out of habit. No new messages from Daniel. Inside, the space buzzed with overlapping conversations. Laughter bounced off the brick walls. Someone clinked a glass to get attention near the bar. For a split second, I felt relief. The normalcy of it all wrapped around me like a blanket. Then I stepped fully into the room. The shift was subtle, almost polite. A man I recognized from a software startup met my eyes across the room, smiled automatically, then looked away a second too quickly. A woman I'd shared panels with nodded at me but didn't cross the space like she usually did. Conversations didn't stop when I approached, but they bent, changed direction, lowered in volume. No one said anything unkind. That was the strangest part. I picked up a glass of wine I didn't want and stood near one of the tall tables. I listened. Names floated past me. Deals, expansions, staffing issues, the usual language of optimism and control. When someone joined the table, they acknowledged everyone except me, as if my presence were an inconvenient variable. I told myself I was imagining it. At the far end of the room, I spotted Linda, a consultant I'd known for years. She saw me at the same time and hesitated, her hand half raised in greeting. Then she walked over. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "So am I," I replied. "I think." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. It wasn't something you asked casually, not in a room like this. "I'm fine," I said. "Why?" She glanced around, lowering her voice. "There's talk." "What kind of talk?" "Nothing concrete," she said quickly. "Just people being careful." "Careful again." "With what?" I pressed. She shifted her weight. "Associations. Appearances." Tanema, that word hit harder than I expected. Appearances. Not facts, not truth. Just how things looked. "I haven't done anything wrong," I said. "I know," she said. "I know you haven't." The way she said it made my stomach twist. As if knowledge were something separate from action. As if knowing and standing by someone were two different choices. Before I could respond, Someone called her name from across the room. She gave my arm a brief squeeze. "Call me later," she said. "Okay?" She didn't wait for my answer. I moved toward the bar, weaving through clusters of people. As I did, I caught fragments of conversation that made my skin prickle. Compliance review. Risk exposure. Just until it's resolved. No one said my name. They didn't need to. I ordered another glass of wine and took a sip, though my mouth was dry. Across the room, I saw a group of people I'd worked with recently, laughing, their heads close together. One of them noticed me watching and immediately turned his back. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Recognition. This was what exclusion looked like in polite spaces. No confrontation, no accusation. Just a quiet rearranging of social distance. I checked my phone again. Still nothing from Daniel. I thought about leaving. I thought about pushing through the room, forcing conversations, demanding clarity. But instinct told me it wouldn't help. This wasn't a problem I could solve with words. At a high-top table near the back, I overheard two men talking in low voices. "Do you think it's serious?" one asked. The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter. No one wants to be the one who didn't step back soon enough." I turned away before they noticed me. That was the moment it became personal, in a way I couldn't rationalize away. Not because my reputation was at risk. I had always known that was fragile. But because I was being evaluated by people who had once trusted me, without ever being asked to explain myself. The room hadn't turned hostile. It had turned cautious. And caution, I realized, could be just as isolating as judgment. I excused myself and stepped outside onto the loading dock behind the building. The air was cold and smelled faintly of the river. I leaned against the railing and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My phone buzzed. "Daniel. Sorry I missed you earlier," his message read. "Things are moving. Try not to engage with anyone tonight." I stared at the screen. "Why?" I typed. A few seconds passed. "Because perception matters," he replied. "And right now, you need to let me manage it." Manage it. I felt a flicker of irritation, quickly tamped down. Daniel was under pressure too, I told myself. He was handling the technical side. He knew more than I did. Still, something about his wording unsettled me. I typed, then deleted. A response. Then typed again. "I'm already here," I wrote. "People are avoiding me." He didn't respond right away. When he did, the message was short. "That's temporary. Temporary." I slid my phone back into my pocket and looked out at the dark water beyond the dock. The city lights reflected in uneven streaks, broken and distorted by the current. Inside, I could hear laughter again. Someone had started clapping near the bar. A small cheer went up. The event was continuing without me, smoothly, effortlessly. I realized then that no one was waiting for this to resolve before moving on. They were already adapting. By the time I drove home that night, the sense of unease had settled into something heavier. A quiet understanding that whatever was happening was no longer contained to emails and bank accounts. It had entered the social bloodstream. And once that happened, facts alone were rarely enough to reverse it. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car with the engine running, hands on the steering wheel. My house looked the same as it always had. Lights on in the living room. A stack of mail on the table, visible through the window. Safe, familiar. But I knew that feeling wouldn't last. Because something fundamental had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough that the rules I thought governed my world were no longer being applied the way I understood them. And whatever came next would not be decided in rooms like the one I had just left. It would be decided somewhere quieter. Somewhere I had not been invited. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slid halfway under my front door like it was unsure whether it belonged inside. I noticed it only because the edge of the envelope caught the light when I walked past. Thick paper, cream-colored, the kind of envelope you don't get for anything casual. No logo, no friendly return address. Just a block of printed text in the upper left corner and my firm's name typed neatly in the center. Not my name, the firm's. I picked it up and stood there for a moment, holding it by the corner like it might stain my fingers. The weight of it felt deliberate, heavier than necessary. I checked the postmark. certified mail, restricted delivery. I hadn't signed for it. That was the first odd thing. Inside, my house was quiet. The dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen. I set the envelope on the table and made coffee before opening it. An old habit when I didn't like what I was about to read. Delay the moment. Control the pace. When I finally tore it open, the paper inside was folded into thirds, crisp and precise. No wasted space, no greetings. Notice of regulatory inquiry. The words sat at the top of the page in bold type, impersonal and final. I skimmed the first paragraph, then read it again more slowly. The notice informed the recipient again, not me personally, that an inquiry had been initiated into certain financial activities connected to my firm. It referenced statutes, sections, jurisdictions. The language was careful, almost courteous. Nowhere did it accuse. Nowhere did it explain. Halfway down the page, a line stopped me cold. Failure to preserve all relevant records may result in additional penalties. Preserve. As if something were already assumed to be in danger. I turned the page. The second sheet listed points of contact, departments, offices, names. And then, at the bottom, in smaller type, a sentence that made my throat tighten. This notice does not require a response from the above-named firm at this time. I read that line 3 times. Did not require a response. They were telling me I was not part of the conversation. I sat down heavily in the chair and let the paper rest on the table in front of me. My coffee had gone untouched, steam curling upward and disappearing into the air. I checked the address again. The firm's name, the office address, all correct. The problem wasn't that I had received the letter. The problem was that I hadn't been invited to speak. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the notice, then sent it to my lawyer with a single line of text. "This just arrived," she replied within minutes. "Do not contact them directly," she wrote. "We'll talk today." I set the phone down and stared at the wall. The clock above the doorway ticked loudly, each second marking time in a way that felt suddenly aggressive. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was procedure. By mid-morning, I had canceled the rest of my calls. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I could no longer pretend to be fully present. Every sentence felt like it might be the wrong one. Every promise felt provisional. At 11:07 a.m., Daniel finally called. "I heard you got the notice," he said, without greeting. My grip tightened around the phone. "You knew about it," I said. "Yes," he replied calmly. "That's what I've been dealing with. You told me it was routine. It is. Quote, easy far. This letter says they don't want a response from us. From you," he corrected gently. "From the firm." The distinction made my stomach turn. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they're still gathering information," he said. "Once they're ready, we'll be looped in." "We." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. "You've been looped in already," I said. A pause. "I'm handling communications for now," he replied. "It's cleaner that way." "Cleaner? Why?" I asked. "Because you're too close to it," he said. "And because right now, your name carries risk." There it was, out in the open. "My name carries risk," I repeated. "Temporarily," he said. "Let me do my job." Something inside me went very still. "What exactly is your job right now?" I asked. "To protect the firm," he said without hesitation. "Not me. The firm." I closed my eyes. "You authorized a transaction under my credentials," I said quietly. Another pause. Longer this time. "It was necessary," he replied. "Necessary for what?" "For stability," he said. "For leverage. You don't get compliance attention without scale." I felt a chill move down my spine. "You used my name," I said. "I had access," he replied. "Legally." The word landed like a blade. "Legally. Did you tell them it was me?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "I didn't correct them," he said finally. "There's a difference." I laughed then. A short, sharp sound that surprised even me. "So I'm the face," I said, "and you're the handler." "That's not fair," he replied. "This is how systems work. Someone has to be visible. And you decided that someone was me." "You're the founder," he said. "Your name is already attached." I stood up and began pacing the kitchen. Phone pressed to my ear, my free hand clenched and unclenched without me noticing. "You froze my access," I said. "For your own good," he replied. "So you don't say the wrong thing." "The wrong thing." I stopped pacing. "You didn't ask me," I said. "I didn't have time," he said. Things moved quickly. They had moved quickly, just not in directions I had chosen. "I trusted you," I said. "I know," he replied softly. "That's why this works." The line went quiet between us. I realized then that the letter had never been meant for me. Not really. It was meant to establish a perimeter, to mark territory, to signal who was inside the process and who was being observed from the outside. And I was on the outside. After we hung up, I sat back down and picked up the notice again. This time, I read it not as a recipient, but as an artifact, a piece of choreography. It was designed to unsettle without engaging, to warn without accusing, to isolate without naming names. By the end of the afternoon, I had received 2 more messages from clients asking for updates. One asked directly if I was being investigated. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was beginning to understand that every word I spoke could be used to reinforce a narrative I hadn't agreed to. That evening, as the light faded and my kitchen filled with shadows, I placed the letter back into its envelope and slid it into a folder with a dozen other documents I had started collecting. I labeled the folder with a single word: timeline. I didn't know yet what I was building, but I knew this much. The story had reached a point where silence was no longer neutral, and whatever came next would be decided not by what I believed to be true, but by what could be proven, preserved, and if necessary, sacrificed, including me. Once the letter existed, everything else rearranged itself around it. I stopped thinking in terms of intentions and started thinking in terms of permissions. Who could see what? Who could move money? Who could speak on behalf of the firm without asking? When I laid it out that way, the circle grew very small, very fast. There were 3 people with any meaningful access to our systems. My assistant, who handled scheduling and invoicing, but had no authority to approve transactions. Our external bookkeeper, whose role was limited to reconciliation and reporting. And Daniel, who had insisted on setting up the architecture correctly from the beginning. Daniel, who had walked me through the permissions screens and said, "This will make your life easier." Daniel, who knew the difference between access and attribution and had taught me to appreciate it as a technical nuance rather than a moral line. I did not confront him right away. That surprised me. Later, when I tried to explain myself to my lawyer and even to my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. People expect confrontation to be immediate, explosive. They imagine raised voices and accusations. The truth was quieter, colder. I needed to understand the shape of what he had done before I named it. So I watched. I watched the way he spoke on calls, calm and measured, always framing events as processes rather than choices. I watched how he forwarded emails with brief notes, "For your information," handled, "No action needed," as if his annotations were sufficient to close entire threads of concern. I watched the way he referred to the firm as an entity separate from me, something that could be protected even if I could not. We had a video call scheduled for Friday afternoon. I logged in early and waited. The camera reflected my own face back at me, paler than usual, eyes ringed with shadow. When Daniel joined, he looked exactly as he always did. Relaxed, put together. A neutral background behind him, carefully chosen. "Hey," he said. "Rough week." "That's one word for it," I replied. He smiled faintly, as if appreciating the understatement. "I want to walk you through where things stand," he continued. "Just so you're not blindsided." I noticed the phrasing. Not so you can decide. Not so you can object. Just so you're informed. "Go ahead," I said. He spoke for 15 minutes, without interruption. About regulatory posture, about risk mitigation, about narrative management. He used words like exposure and containment, the way doctors talk about infections. At no point did he say, "I'm sorry." When he finished, I leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me you were authorizing transactions under my credentials?" I asked. He didn't flinch. You delegated authority, he said. That's what delegation is. 1. And it hair. Delegation is not impersonation, I replied. It's not impersonation if it's permitted, he said evenly. There it was again. That word, permitted. You knew it would trigger scrutiny, I said. Yes. And you did it anyway. Yes, without telling me. I told you it was routine, he said. You didn't ask for details. The logic was airtight in a way that made my skin crawl. You used my name to create scale, I said. He nodded slightly. That's how attention works. Systems don't react to caution. They react to volume. And I was the volume, I said. You were the founder, he corrected. Founders absorb shock. That's part of the role. I felt something settle into place then, a final alignment of facts that could no longer be argued away. He was not confused. He was not panicking. He was executing a strategy he believed in. What happens to me? I asked. He hesitated for the first time. Short term, he said. You keep your head down. You let me handle communications. You don't contradict anything. And long term? That depends, he said carefully, on how cooperative you are. Cooperative. I stared at him through the screen, at the man I had trusted with the machinery of my life. You're asking me to take responsibility for actions I didn't take, I said. I'm asking you to stand by the structure you built, he replied. You can't claim the benefits of authority without accepting its costs. If fire. The line might have impressed someone else. It sounded like wisdom. To me, it sounded like a justification rehearsed long before I ever needed it. After the call ended, I sat at my desk and opened the access logs again. This time, I didn't skim. I traced every entry, every timestamp, every action. I cross-referenced them with emails Daniel had sent, calls he had claimed to be on, meetings he had scheduled. The pattern was undeniable. He had been careful. He had spaced the actions out. He had never done anything so blatant that it could not be explained as an administrative necessity. He had also made sure that every significant action carried my digital signature. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a design. I called my lawyer and asked a question I hadn't wanted to ask before. If someone has legal access to my credentials and uses them in a way that harms me, who's responsible? I said. She was quiet for a moment. That depends, she said, on whether the system recognizes harm or authority. And which does it recognize more? I asked. Authority, she said. Almost always. I thanked her and hung up. That night, I dreamed about keys, rows of them, all identical, laid out on a table. I kept picking them up, trying to remember which one belonged to which door. Every time I chose one, it fit. Every lock opened, and every room led back to the same place. I woke before dawn, heart racing. In the days that followed, Daniel grew more confident. He spoke as if the path forward had already been agreed upon. He used phrases like, "when this settles," and "once you're cleared," though he never specified what clearance would require. I stopped correcting him. Instead, I listened. I noted how often he referred to me in the third person when speaking to others. She's aware. She understands. She's aligned. Each statement nudged me further out of my own story. One afternoon, while reviewing a document he had sent for my records, I noticed something small. A clause buried deep in an addendum. Language about indemnification, about personal liability. I read it twice, then a third time. "Did you add this?" I asked him in a message. "Yes," he replied. "Standard protection." "For whom?" I asked. "For the firm," he said. "Not for me." I closed the document and stared at the wall. The realization was complete now, heavy and unmistakable. Daniel hadn't just acted without my consent. He had positioned me as the visible center of risk, as the buffer between the system and itself, as the person who would absorb consequences while he retained mobility. It would have been easier if he had hated me, but he didn't. He respected me. In his way, he believed I was strong enough to carry this, that my ethics, my reputation, my reluctance to cause harm would keep me compliant. He believed my silence was predictable. That belief, more than anything else, changed something in me. Because once I understood who had access and how it had been used, the problem was no longer betrayal. It was leverage, and leverage could be answered, just not the way he expected. The first thing I did was stop looking for proof that would make me feel better. That urge was strong at first. The human instinct to find the email where someone admits fault, the text message that reveals intent, the dramatic piece of evidence that turns confusion into clarity. I had watched enough cases, advised enough clients, to know how comforting that kind of proof can be. It also rarely exists. What does exist, almost always, is data. Data does not apologize. It does not explain itself. It does not soften its edges to spare anyone's pride. It records what happened, when it happened, and under whose authority it was allowed to happen. It doesn't care who you trusted or why. So I stopped rereading conversations and started exporting logs. I began with the access records. Every system we used kept them, though most people never bothered to look. They were meant for audits, for disputes that everyone assumes will never involve them. I pulled them into spreadsheets and sorted by timestamp, by user, by action. The patterns sharpened immediately. Authorizations clustered around specific times of day: early mornings, late evenings, periods when Daniel knew I would be offline or unavailable. Transactions executed within narrow windows, just large enough to trip internal thresholds without triggering automatic shutdowns. Careful, deliberate. I matched those timestamps to his calendar, calls he said he was on. Meetings, he claimed, took his full attention. The overlaps were too precise to be coincidence. Next, I examined the digital signature trail. Every approval carried metadata, device identifiers, IP addresses, geographic markers. The approvals bearing my name came from locations I had never been. I felt a flicker of something like vindication when I saw that. Proof, finally, that it wasn't me, that I hadn't imagined this. The feeling passed quickly. Because proof doesn't function the way people think it does. It doesn't leap up and announce itself. It waits, quietly, indifferently. It becomes powerful only when placed in the right context. And context was something Daniel controlled. I created a separate folder on an external drive and began saving everything there. Screenshots, exports, copies of documents before and after revisions. I labeled each file carefully, not with emotional shorthand but with neutral descriptors. Date, system, action. I did not tell anyone I was doing this. Not my assistant, not my lawyer, not even myself. Fully, in words. It felt safer to treat it like a technical exercise, something procedural, something I could do without acknowledging what it meant. As the days passed, more information surfaced. An email chain forwarded to me by mistake, in which Daniel spoke to a compliance consultant about managing founder exposure. A draft document he shared for review that referenced anticipated leadership restructuring without ever using my name. I read these things slowly, as if speed might distort them. One afternoon, while comparing two versions of a financial report, I noticed a discrepancy so small it could have been missed easily. A rounding adjustment, a minor reclassification, the kind of thing that looks harmless unless you understand why it's there. I traced it back. It led to a transaction I hadn't approved, routed through a subsidiary account I hadn't known existed. That was when I stopped pretending this was about misunderstanding. This was architecture. Someone had built a structure in which my credibility was both asset and shield, where my reluctance to escalate would be read as cooperation, where my silence would be interpreted as consent. I thought about the clients who had gone quiet, the partners who had stepped back, the room that had gotten quieter instead of louder. They weren't responding to accusations. They were responding to absence. In the absence of a counter-narrative, the system had supplied one. I scheduled a call with my lawyer and did something I hadn't done yet. I showed her the data, not selectively, not the parts that made me look blameless, all of it. The logs, the signatures, the timelines, the clauses buried in documents Daniel had drafted. She didn't interrupt while I spoke. She didn't offer reassurance. She asked questions that made me uncomfortable, precise ones, questions about delegation language, about my role in approving system access, about what I had known and when. At the end of the call, she exhaled slowly. "This is strong," she said. "Strong enough to clear me?" I asked. She hesitated. "It's strong enough to show that you didn't personally execute these actions," she said. "It's not strong enough, on its own, to prove you didn't allow them." The distinction settled heavily between us. "What would be?" I asked. "Intent," she said, "or a pattern that contradicts the one being presented." "And whose pattern is being presented?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. "The firm's," she said finally, as represented by the person communicating on its behalf. "Daniel." I ended the call and sat at my desk, hands folded, eyes unfocused. I had done everything I was supposed to do. I had kept records. I had followed procedures. I had trusted someone I had vetted as thoroughly as I knew how. And still, the system tilted away from me. That was when the deeper realization set in. This was not a question of truth versus falsehood. It was a question of narrative velocity. Daniel's version of events was moving faster than mine. It was being repeated, refined, stabilized. Mine was still trapped inside documents no one had asked to see yet. Data waits. Stories, travel. I needed to decide which one I was trying to win with. That night, I sat on my living room floor with my laptop open, documents spread around me like pieces of a puzzle. I noticed how calm I felt. Not numb, not resigned, focused. For the first time since the bank notification, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. I thought about confronting Daniel with the evidence, about forcing a reckoning, about demanding he step back, issue corrections, take responsibility. I pictured the conversation clearly. I also pictured how it would end. He would express disappointment. He would frame it as a misunderstanding. He would remind me of shared goals, shared risks. He would warn me politely that escalation would harm the firm, the clients, the employees. He would be right, at least in the short term. I thought about going to regulators directly, about submitting everything and trusting the process. I had spent my career advising people on exactly that path. I also knew how slow it was, how unforgiving, how little room it left for nuance. I was not afraid of investigation. I was afraid of being reduced to a case study while other people continued to operate. As I sat there, one thought became unavoidable. If I cleared my name loudly and publicly, I would burn down more than just Daniel's position. I would expose vulnerabilities in systems that dozens of small businesses depended on, businesses run by people who had trusted me, who had no idea they were part of this architecture. The data made that clear too. This wasn't isolated. My name had been used because it was clean. The structure had been tested elsewhere, on smaller scales, with quieter consequences. That was the moral weight of it. I wasn't just deciding how to protect myself. I was deciding how much damage I was willing to cause in order to do so. I closed my laptop and leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a car passed, headlights briefly sweeping across the wall. Data does not care about feelings, but people do. And whatever I chose to do next would determine which one I was willing to sacrifice. Not for revenge, not for vindication, but for control. Because if I did nothing, the system would continue to use my name exactly as it had been. And that, I realized, was no longer an option. There is a moment in every slow disaster when you realize that doing nothing is also an action. It doesn't arrive with drama. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, disguised as patience, as professionalism, as restraint. You tell yourself you are being reasonable. You tell yourself you are waiting for the right time. What you are really doing is letting someone else decide for you. I recognized that moment on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after I finished assembling the data, when I received an email from a client I had worked with since the beginning. One of the first, a woman who had trusted me when I still answered my own phones and sent invoices manually. Her message was short. I need to know if I should start looking for a new advisor. No accusation, no anger, just fear. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My instinct was to reassure her, to explain, to promise that everything would be resolved soon. I had written and erased 3 different responses before stopping myself. Soon meant nothing. Resolved meant nothing. What she was really asking was whether my name was still safe to stand under. And I didn't know how to answer that without lying. I closed the email without replying and leaned back in my chair. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching dust in the air. The office was quiet again, but this time it wasn't unfamiliar. It felt intentional, like a room waiting for a decision. The truth I had been avoiding finally surfaced in full. If I fought this publicly, if I pushed my evidence forward aggressively, I would clear my name. Eventually, I had enough data to do that. Enough to show that the actions attributed to me were executed elsewhere, under a structure I had not designed to deceive. But I would also trigger a chain reaction. The systems Daniel had put in place did not exist in isolation. They touched clients, vendors, other small firms who had adopted similar frameworks because I had recommended them, because they trusted my judgment. If regulators pulled on one thread, they would pull on all of them. Some of those businesses would survive the scrutiny, some would not. And the ones that didn't would not fail because they were corrupt or careless, but because they were small, under-resourced, unable to absorb the cost of being examined at scale. I thought about Maria, about the way her voice had sounded on the phone, cautious and concerned, about the employees who depended on her business, about how proud she had been when she finally hired her first full-time staff member. Clearing my name would mean putting hers at risk. That was the part no one talks about when they say, just tell the truth. Truth is not neutral. It has consequences. And sometimes those consequences land on people who never agreed to be part of the story. I called my lawyer again. I need to understand my options, I said. Not legally, practically. She listened while I explained the broader implications, the interconnected systems, the potential fallout. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You're not obligated to protect anyone else, she said carefully. I know, I replied, but I'm not obligated to destroy them either. It's Devaney. No, she agreed. You're not. What happens if I step back? I asked. If I remove myself from the picture? She didn't answer immediately. That would change the narrative, she said finally, but not necessarily in your favor. I'm not asking about favor, I said. I'm asking about leverage. Another pause. If you're no longer visible, she said, the system will have to adjust. It will look for another center. And that center won't be me, I said. No, she replied. It won't. After we hung up, I sat there with my hands folded, absorbing the weight of what that meant. Stepping back didn't mean surrender. It meant refusing to be the buffer. It meant letting the architecture reveal itself without my credibility propping it up. But it also meant something else, something more personal. It meant walking away from the thing I had built. Not because it wasn't worth saving, but because saving it under these terms would require me to become complicit in a story I didn't believe in. That night, I slept poorly. My mind kept circling the same questions, turning them over from different angles, looking for a version that hurt less. By morning, the questions had stopped. In their place was a strange, steady calm. I went into the office early and began doing things I hadn't planned to do for months. I drafted a resignation letter, not from the firm, but from every operational role I held within it. I removed myself as an authorized signatory. I initiated the process of transferring administrative control to a neutral third-party service. Each action felt surreal, like watching myself in a mirror. This was my business, my name, my work, and yet, as I executed each step, I felt lighter. At noon, I called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. Good news? He asked lightly. I'm stepping back, I said. Silence. What do you mean? He asked. I'm resigning from day-to-day operations, I replied. Effective immediately. That's not necessary, he said quickly. We're close to stabilizing this. That's exactly why it is, I said. You're overreacting, he said. This will look like an admission. Only if I stay silent, I replied. I won't. He exhaled sharply. You can't just walk away, he said. This is your firm. It was, I said. Now it's an entity. It's also Brex-Dover. That doesn't protect you, he warned. No, I agreed. It protects everyone else. He laughed then, not humorously, with disbelief. You think this makes you noble, he said. It makes you expendable. Maybe, I replied, but not controllable. The line went dead. Within hours, word began to spread, quietly at first, that I had stepped down, that I was taking time away, that I was cooperating fully. The interpretations varied. I didn't correct them. I sent a brief message to clients, drafted with my lawyer's help. It said only that I was transitioning out of operational leadership and that their work would continue without disruption. It did not defend me. It did not explain. Several wrote back with concern, a few with disappointment, one with anger. I answered none of them. Instead, I packed up my office. I took the framed certificates off the wall, the books I had brought from home, the plant that had survived 2 moves and more neglect than it deserved. As I worked, I felt the gravity of what I was doing. This was not a temporary retreat. This was a severing. And yet, I did not feel defeated. I felt deliberate. That evening, I handed my assistant a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it unless certain conditions were met. I explained nothing. She looked at me as if she wanted to ask questions. She didn't. I drove home through streets I knew well, the city moving around me as it always had. Nothing had changed on the surface. Traffic lights cycled, pedestrians crossed, restaurants filled and emptied. But for me, the center of gravity had shifted. I was no longer trying to clear my name inside a system that had already decided how to use it. I was stepping outside of it. I did not know yet what that would cost me. I only knew that staying would cost more, and somewhere in that decision made quietly, without witnesses, I crossed a line I hadn't known existed. From defending myself to redefining the game. Everything after that would be built on that choice. The morning after I stepped back, I woke up without the familiar knot in my chest. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected panic, regret, the sharp fear that comes when you realize you have just walked away from the one thing anchoring your identity. Instead, there was a strange clarity, like the quiet that settles after a storm when the air feels scrubbed clean. I didn't go to court. I didn't call the regulators. I didn't issue a statement. That restraint wasn't fear. It was strategy. For years, I had advised people that escalation should be deliberate, not emotional. That once you file something formally, you give up control over timing, tone, and scope. I had said those words so often they had become reflex. Now they applied to me. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop closed. I wrote nothing. I called no one. I let the day unfold without me chasing it. By noon, the messages started coming in. Daniel texted first. "This is getting messy," he wrote. "We need to align." I didn't respond. An hour later, my assistant emailed. "People are asking who's in charge now." I forwarded the message to the interim service managing operations and replied with a single line. "Please direct all operational questions there." No explanations, no commentary. What I was doing, I realized, was removing friction. I was letting the system move without me resisting it. When you stop pushing against something, its true shape becomes visible. That afternoon, my lawyer called. "They've noticed," she said. "Who has?" I asked. "Everyone who is used to hearing your name," she replied. "The silence is noticeable." "That's the point," I said. She didn't argue. Instead, she asked, "What are you planning?" I thought about that before answering. "I'm creating a record," I said. "One that doesn't rely on me being present to be believed." End quote. There was a pause on the line. "That's smart," she said finally. "And dangerous." "I know," I replied. What I didn't say was that it was also necessary. If I went to court first, everything would collapse into a single narrative. Founder accused, founder defends herself, founder pleads innocence. The focus would be on me, my credibility, my decisions. Daniel would become a secondary character at worst, an unnamed operator at best, and the structure would remain intact. I didn't want to be the story. I wanted the system to trip over itself. Over the next few days, I watched from a distance. Without my name at the center, communication slowed. Emails grew longer, more careful. Decisions that had once moved swiftly now stalled, caught in loops of approval and second-guessing. Daniel's confidence, once effortless, began to sound strained in forwarded messages. He needed a face, and I wasn't providing one. Instead, I began reaching out quietly, selectively, to people who understood patterns rather than personalities. A former compliance officer who had left public service to work in policy advocacy. An attorney known for representing whistleblowers, not in court, but in negotiations before court ever became necessary. I didn't tell them my story all at once. I showed them fragments. A log here, a clause there, a timeline without commentary. I let them ask questions. "What happens if this founder stays visible?" one of them asked. "She absorbs liability," I replied. "And if she disappears?" another asked. "The structure has to explain itself," I said. They exchanged looks I couldn't see over the phone. "That's risky," the attorney said. "They might scapegoat you anyway." "I know," I replied, "but they'll have to do it without my cooperation." That mattered more than it might sound, because cooperation is what systems count on. Silence they can interpret, resistance they can punish, but non-participation forces adjustment. Meanwhile, Daniel kept reaching out. His messages shifted in tone. First came irritation, then concern, then something like bargaining. "This isn't the time to disappear," he wrote one evening. "You're making yourself look unstable." I read the message twice, then closed it. The next morning, an article appeared in a local business newsletter. A small mention buried halfway down the page. A consulting firm undergoing leadership transition amid regulatory review. No names, no details. But it was enough. I forwarded it to my lawyer. "This has started," I wrote. "Yes," she replied. "And you're not in the headline." That was the point. Over the following week, I began doing something that felt almost rebellious in its simplicity. I stopped defending myself. When people reached out asking for explanations, I thanked them for their concern and told them I was unavailable for comment. When former clients asked if they should worry, I told them to direct questions to the firm's interim management. I let discomfort do its work. At the same time, behind the scenes, the record was taking shape. The whistleblower attorney helped me map the flow of authority. Not who did what, but who enabled what. Who benefited from opacity. Who had incentives to keep certain names attached and others invisible. It became clear that Daniel had not acted alone. He had acted with assumption. The assumption that I would not walk away. The assumption that I would prioritize preservation over disruption. The assumption that my ethics would keep me quiet. That assumption had been his greatest leverage. Now it was gone. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. "This is Claire Jensen," the voice said. "I work with a compliance watchdog group." I recognized the name. They monitored regulatory capture, conflicts of interest, systemic loopholes. They didn't litigate. They documented. "I was told you might be willing to speak," she said. "I'm willing to listen," I replied. She didn't rush. She asked me to describe my role, my exit, and what I had observed. She didn't ask me to accuse anyone. She asked me to describe processes. At the end of the call, she said something that stuck with me. "People think accountability starts with blame," she said. "It doesn't. It starts with visibility." That night, I went for a long walk. The city felt different now that I wasn't carrying the burden of explanation everywhere I went. I passed storefronts I had advised, businesses I had helped stabilize years ago. Life moved on, as it always does. I realized then that going to court would have been the obvious move. It would have made sense. It would have satisfied the need for public resolution. But it would also have narrowed the story to my survival. I wasn't interested in surviving this. I was interested in ending it. Not with a verdict, but with exposure. By the end of the week, Daniel stopped texting. Not because the situation had resolved, but because my absence had created a vacuum he couldn't fill indefinitely. Without my presence, without my voice, without my implicit endorsement, his authority began to look like what it was: borrowed. I sat at my desk that evening, looking at the growing archive of documents, communications, and analyses that now existed independently of me. It no longer required my interpretation to make sense. That was when I understood the real power of not going to court first. Court demands that you prove harm. Systems collapse when they are forced to reveal function. and I had given them no choice but to do exactly that. Whatever came next would not be about my innocence. It would be about their design. And for the first time since this began, I knew exactly where I stood. Not in front of the system, but just far enough outside it to let it show its seams. Disappearing is easier than people think. You don't need to change your name or move to a remote cabin. You don't need to delete every account or sever every connection. All you have to do is stop feeding the machine that expects you to show up on cue. I stopped posting. I stopped attending. I stopped answering questions that weren't mine to answer. From the outside, it probably looked like retreat. Burnout, maybe. A founder overwhelmed by scrutiny, stepping aside to focus on personal matters. That story was convenient. It required no effort from anyone else. People like explanations that let them move on. I let them have it. Behind the scenes, though, nothing was idle. The first thing I did was formalize my absence. With my lawyer's help, I filed the paperwork that finalized my removal from all operational authority. Not temporarily, not pending review. Cleanly, irrevocably. No one could say I was still influencing decisions. That mattered, because influence, even perceived influence, is what allows responsibility to be deflected. Next, I transferred ownership of my internal documentation archive to a neutral trust, not to protect it, but to distance it from me. Every file was hashed, time-stamped, and duplicated. Any future claim that something had been altered or selectively presented would fail on contact. I wasn't building a case. I was building an artifact. At the same time, the watchdog group began their work. Quietly, methodically. They didn't announce investigations. They didn't threaten exposure. They requested information, compared notes, mapped relationships. They asked me to clarify processes, not motivations. How were permissions granted? Who approved overrides? What safeguards existed, and how were they bypassed? I answered those questions once, in writing, and then stepped back again. The rest did not require me. That was the most unsettling part for the people still inside the system. I had always been responsive, reliable, the person who filled gaps and smoothed over rough edges. My absence wasn't just logistical, it was structural. Decisions that had once flowed through me now had to route around an empty space. And empty spaces make systems nervous. Within a week, Daniel began to feel the pressure. I didn't hear it directly. I heard it secondhand, through forwarded emails and concerned phone calls from people who were suddenly realizing that alignment was harder to maintain without my quiet consent. He was asked to explain decisions he had never expected to justify, to sign off on things he had previously framed as collective judgment, to take responsibility without the cover of my name. The tone of his communications shifted. Where he had once spoken in abstractions, he now spoke in specifics. Where he had once invoked the firm, he now referenced himself. It was subtle, but it mattered. At the same time, the compliance watchdog group began connecting dots I had only suspected existed. Similar structures, similar permission models, similar patterns of founder exposure across multiple firms. I was not unique. That realization landed with both relief and horror. Relief, because it meant I hadn't failed alone. Horror, because it meant the problem was systemic. They shared their preliminary findings with me in a call I almost declined. I listened while they explained how the same architecture had been deployed in different contexts, always with the same logic. Put a trusted figure at the front. Centralize control behind the scenes. Use legitimacy as insulation. It works because most people don't want to blow up their own lives, one of them said. They choose containment over confrontation. Actions. I thought about how close I had come to doing exactly that. What happens next? I asked. We make it visible, she replied, without you being the headline. Visibility took many forms. A policy brief circulated quietly among regulators. An internal memo flagged patterns rather than individuals. A series of questions sent to institutions that had previously accepted certain structures without scrutiny. None of it mentioned my name. That omission was intentional. Because the moment my name appeared, the conversation would narrow. It would become personal, defensive, easier to dismiss as a single bad actor or an isolated failure. Without a name, the system had to respond to itself. Meanwhile, Daniel reached out one last time. This time, he called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, his voice was different. Tired, edged with something like disbelief. They're asking questions I can't answer, he said. Who is? I asked. Everyone, he replied. They want to know why certain permissions exist, why certain approvals were routed the way they were. I said nothing. You could help clarify this, he continued. You built a lot of this with me. No, I replied calmly. I didn't. You know what I mean, he said. I do, I agreed. And that's why I won't. There was a long silence. You're letting this burn, he said finally. I'm letting it be seen, I replied. That will take us all down, he said. No, I said. It will take down what can't justify itself. He laughed, short and bitter. You think you're outside this, he said. You think this won't touch you. I know it will, I replied. That's the difference. The call ended without resolution. In the days that followed, I kept my distance. I didn't monitor updates obsessively. I didn't ask for progress reports. I trusted the process I had helped initiate to move at its own pace. Instead, I focused on something smaller. I began sketching a new framework, not a business plan, not a comeback, a set of principles for how authority could be distributed without turning legitimacy into liability. It was rough, incomplete, but it felt honest. I didn't know if I would ever use it. I only knew that I would never again build something that required one person to be both shield and sacrifice. One evening, weeks later, my lawyer called. They've issued guidance, she said. Not a ruling. Guidance. End quote. For whom? I asked. For institutions that use founder-led structures, she replied. New questions, new requirements. I closed my eyes. Does it mention me? I asked. No, she said. Not at all. That was the point. The system was adjusting. Slowly, imperfectly, but in ways that would make what Daniel had done harder to repeat. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like correction. By the time the story reached the broader public stripped of names, framed as a policy shift, I had already moved on. Not emotionally, not entirely, but strategically. I had let them think I disappeared. In reality, I had simply stepped far enough back to stop being used as leverage. And in doing so, I had forced the system to confront itself. Not because I was brave, not because I was selfless, but because I refused to keep holding a position that existed only to absorb damage. Whatever came next for me would be built without that role. And that, I realized, was the first real freedom I had felt since this began. There was a moment, a few weeks after everything went quiet, when I could have taken my name back. The opportunity arrived without ceremony, the way most consequential things do. An email from my lawyer, forwarded without commentary, a draft statement attached, clean, precise, legally sound. It laid out the facts in a way that left very little room for misinterpretation. It would have cleared me. Not instantly, not completely, but enough. Enough that my name would no longer carry an unspoken question mark. Enough that former clients could point to something concrete if anyone asked why they had stayed. Enough that people who had stepped back could step forward again without feeling exposed. I read the statement twice, then a third time, more slowly. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It corrected the record, and in doing so, it quietly asked me to resume my place in it. That was the part that gave me pause, because taking my name back did not just mean reclaiming my reputation. It meant re-entering a system that had already shown me how it functioned under pressure. It meant becoming legible again to structures that preferred individuals to be identifiable, manageable, and when necessary, expendable. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the day was unremarkable. Gray sky, wet pavement, a neighbor walking past with a grocery bag that looked too heavy for one hand. Life continuing at its usual pace, indifferent to whether my name was attached to anything or not. I thought about how much effort I had spent, over the years, making my name visible. On proposals, on panels, on recommendations and referrals. Visibility had always felt like progress, like proof that I existed in the professional world in a way that mattered. Now I understood it differently. Visibility was also how you got used. When my lawyer called later that afternoon, she didn't try to persuade me. "You have the option," she said. "That's all I want you to understand." "I do," I replied. "And if you don't take it," she continued carefully, "people will draw their own conclusions." "I know," I said. "Some of those conclusions would be wrong, some unfair, some quietly cruel." I accepted that, because what I had gained in the weeks since stepping back was something I hadn't anticipated. Anonymity. Not the kind that erases you, but the kind that removes you from expectation, from constant interpretation, from the obligation to perform coherence for other people's comfort. Without my name circulating, conversations changed. People spoke more freely. Systems revealed themselves more honestly. Accountability shifted from personalities to processes. It was uncomfortable for many. It was clarifying for me. That night, I took a walk through my neighborhood. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks slick and reflective. Porch lights glowed warmly behind curtains. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then went quiet. I realized I wasn't thinking about vindication. I wasn't imagining the moment someone would apologize or admit fault. I was thinking about architecture, about how easy it had been to turn credibility into cover, how often systems relied on someone like me to stand at the front and absorb ambiguity, how rarely that role was acknowledged for what it was. I understood then that if I reclaimed my name publicly, I would also reclaim that role, and I didn't want it anymore. The next morning, I replied to my lawyer with a single sentence: "I'm not issuing this statement." She called me immediately. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I don't want my name corrected. I want it removed." There was a long pause. "That's unusual," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's why it works." I was Love. Over the next few days, the option faded. The draft statement stayed in a folder, unopened. The opportunity to step back into the spotlight passed quietly, without anyone noticing except me. In its place, something else solidified. The Watchdog Group released a follow-up report. Still no names, just patterns. Structural vulnerabilities. Recommendations that made it harder for authority to be concentrated without oversight. Regulators issued clarifications. Not retroactive, not punitive, forward-looking. Daniel resigned from his role 2 weeks later. Not publicly, not dramatically. His departure was framed as a strategic realignment. I heard about it through a third party, the way you hear about distant weather, relevant but no longer personal. People reached out occasionally, asking if I planned to return, if I would rebuild, if this was a pause or an ending. I gave them honest answers. I don't know. Maybe. Not like before. Led. What I didn't tell them was that I had already started something new. Not a firm, not a brand, a framework. I worked quietly with policy advocates, compliance designers, people who thought about systems instead of stages. My contributions were anonymous, my role undefined, my work evaluated on its own merit, without my history attached to it. It was liberating in a way success had never been. No one introduced me. No one quoted me. No one asked me to stand behind anything. And because of that, the work spoke more clearly. One afternoon, months later, I received a message from a former client. "I just wanted you to know," she wrote, "that what you did mattered, even if no one knows it was you." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the message without replying. Not out of coldness, out of completion. I never took my name back. Not because I couldn't, but because I finally understood that my name had been doing a job I never applied for. It had been a placeholder, a shield, a point of absorption. By leaving it behind, I didn't disappear. I stepped out of a role that depended on my silence to function. And in doing so, I changed the only thing that truly mattered. Not how I was seen, but how the system worked when I was no longer willing to stand in front of it. The first time I realized it, I was standing in line at a grocery store. Nothing dramatic. No phone call. No headline, just a bored cashier scanning items too quickly, and a man in front of me arguing about a coupon that had expired the day before. I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't thinking about the firm, or Daniel, or the months that had quietly rearranged my life. I was thinking about dinner. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification from a policy bulletin I was subscribed to under a generic email address. I almost ignored it, but the headline caught my eye. Updated compliance guidance for founder-led financial structures. I opened it. As I read, something strange happened. Line by line, paragraph by paragraph, I recognized the language. Not the wording exactly, but the logic, the flow, the priorities. The sequence of questions institutions were now required to answer. I knew this framework. I had written half of it. Not as a document. As an idea. As a set of principles I had sketched out late at night, sitting on my living room floor, trying to understand how authority could exist without becoming a weapon. I scrolled further. There it was again. A requirement for distributed authorization. Mandatory separation between operational control and reputational liability. Independent review triggers that could not be overridden by a single actor. I felt a slow, quiet recognition settle in my chest. They were using my system. Not my name. Not my story. Not my explanation. Just the structure. I paid for my groceries and walked out into the parking lot, the air cold and sharp against my face. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, letting the realization take its time. This was what I had wanted. Not credit. Not validation. Not even justice. In the way people usually mean it. I wanted the problem to become harder to repeat. In the months that followed, the signs appeared in small, almost invisible ways. A former colleague mentioned, casually, that approvals now required more than one sign-off. A compliance officer I'd once advised complained about new reporting requirements that slowed everything down. A policy panel discussed emerging best practices that sounded suspiciously familiar. I never corrected them. I didn't need to. The system was adjusting. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Daniel never contacted me again. I don't know where he ended up. I heard rumors, the way you do, consulting work, advisory roles, nothing permanent, nothing public. His name still carried weight in some rooms, skepticism in others. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the architecture he had relied on no longer functioned the same way. The shortcuts were narrower, the buffers thinner. The expectation that someone else would quietly absorb risk had been disrupted. As for me, my life became smaller in ways that felt expansive. I took on work that didn't require introduction. I collaborated without ownership. I contributed to discussions where my past was irrelevant because no one knew it. There was a strange peace in that. Without my name attached, I listened more. I noticed patterns others missed. I spoke only when it mattered, and when I did, the ideas stood on their own. People sometimes asked where I had learned to think the way I did. I told them the truth. Experience, I said. They nodded, satisfied. Occasionally, someone would recognize me. A former client, a panel attendee. They would hesitate, then approach cautiously, as if unsure whether I wanted to be acknowledged. "You did the right thing," they would say, quietly. I never knew how to respond to that, because right implies a clear alternative. What I had done hadn't felt right at the time. It had felt necessary. It had felt like choosing the least harmful option in a set of bad ones. It had felt lonely. But standing there, months later, watching a system I once feared quietly reconfigure itself, I understood something I hadn't before. Justice doesn't always arrive as a moment. Sometimes it arrives as an absence. The absence of a loophole. The absence of a familiar pattern. The absence of a name being used where it no longer fits. One evening, I walked past my old office building. The yoga studio was still there, different sign, different hours. The windows above it were dark. I didn't feel the urge to go in. That life belonged to someone else now, not because it had been taken from me, but because I had let it go. I had spent a long time believing that identity was something you had to defend. Now I understood it was something you could outgrow. They still use my system. They use it in boardrooms and policy memos and internal audits. They use it without knowing where it came from or why it was built the way it was. And that is exactly why it works, because it doesn't depend on me. It doesn't require my voice or my reputation or my willingness to stand in front of it and take the hit. It functions on its own, quietly correcting behavior instead of punishing individuals. That was the real twist, the one I hadn't seen coming when this all began. I didn't win by clearing my name. I didn't win by exposing someone else. I didn't win by being proven right. I won by refusing to keep playing a role that only existed to be sacrificed. And in doing so, I left behind something far more durable than a reputation. A system that no longer needs someone like me to hold it together. That is the kind of ending no one applauds, but it is the kind that lasts.